Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed. The Village School. 2 days later, my mother took me to the village school to be admitted as a pupil. It was a rainy morning, and I wore my new mackintosh. In those days, little girls had a garment rather like Red Riding Hood's in shape, consisting of a rubber cape with a hood. The latter could be drawn up round the head and had a minuscule frill all round one's face. Those mackintoshes certainly kept out the rain, which is more than you can say for some of our present-day raincoats, but they were airless and hot. It was almost 1.25 miles to the school, along a lane already showing a few yellow coltsfoot and celandine flowers on the banks, and a thickening of buds on some large and ancient trees, which I soon discovered were elm and walnut. We passed an ivy-covered farmhouse called Julian Brimstone Farm. There was a large yard beside it, and a wall of flint and brick separated it from the road. We paused for a minute to admire the rain-pocked pond where ducks and geese were busy about their affairs. The stables were being cleaned out, steam rising from the dung. The few cart horses were out at work in the fields. We passed the church on our left, standing well back from the road. A row of lime trees led to it. Then the lane passed under a splendid row of ancient elm trees, sloped gently downhill, and we were in the village street. The first building on the right was a cream-painted shed. This was the fire station, and housed, I learnt later, a small machine which could be pushed along by hand and trundled to any local outbreak of fire. Rumor had it that on one of the rare occasions when it was used, the hose was found to be perished and spouted water freely all along its length, but not from the nozzle. The small building was well embedded in a hawthorn hedge, which no doubt afforded sanctuary to many a nesting bird. Almost opposite stood a flint cottage where there lived a German couple called Ulrich. He was something of an artist and designed the black and white drawing on the parish magazine showing St. Martin's Church. There were 3 shops on the right-hand side and a public house called the Five Bells, where our lane met another, and here I had my first view of my new school. I could not believe my eyes. Where was the great 3-story building of red brick? Where was the vast expanse of playground? Here before me was a 1-story building with a slate roof. Steps led up to the small playground, and a row of pollarded lime trees towered above the railings. On climbing the steps, we could then see some sturdy wooden benches set under the trees. The first door had "Boys" written above it, so we went round the building to the back and entered by a door marked "Girls." Presumably mixed infants used this door too. It was very quiet in the lobby, and there was no one to be seen. My mother knocked on the glass of a nearby door, and a pleasant young woman came out and said that if we would wait a moment, she would tell the headmaster that we were there. A headmaster! I was appalled. At my old school, we saw no male teachers, and the ruler of that distant world had been Miss Pope, a headmistress of great dignity. I had heard my Aunt Rose speak of her with due deference, and now and again she entered our classrooms, and we all stood up respectfully. It was she who took assembly in the morning and gave us important instructions, such as urging each of us to bring a handkerchief, or telling us that the Great War had ended, which was why the Union Jack was flying from the flagpole. But a headmaster? Did this mean that boys and girls would all be mixed together, as in my infant's days? I peered through the glass of the classroom door, and there indeed were boys and girls much about my age sitting in desks, although it seemed that 2 boys appeared to share a desk and 2 girls another, so that at least one would have the comfort of sitting beside a girl, evidently, not a boy. While we waited in the lobby among the damp coats and hats, a little girl emerged from another door and skipped up to the wash basin. There were 2 basins, but one was broken, and remained so, I remember, for months. There was a brass tap which gave only cold water, and this little imp set about washing her hands with a piece of yellow sunlight soap, gray and grainy with age. We smiled at each other. My first encounter with one of my schoolfellows cheered me. "Hello," she said. "Miss Smith sent me out." It sounded as though she might be in disgrace, but she showed no sign of distress. In fact, she hummed cheerfully as she endeavored to create a lather, and then wiped her hands on a damp towel hanging nearby. She beamed again. "Goodbye, gotta get back," she volunteered, and skipped back to her classroom, as Mr. Clark, the headmaster, appeared and beckoned us in. He was a squarely built man of medium height, with dark eyes and black hair. His voice was pleasant, his expression kind. I liked him at once. We went through the classroom of the first teacher we had met and were introduced to her. She was Miss Ellis and smiled nicely. I was very conscious of many eyes behind me, no doubt examining me from hair to toes. The headmaster's room, beyond the glass and pine partition, had more eyes watching us. Here the boys and girls were older, some almost grown up, it seemed to me. The oldest must have been a venerable 14. Mr. Clark began to write down the particulars of my age, past schooling, and so on, and my mother went through the usual ritual of spelling our surname, Schaefe, S-H-A-F-E, which always flummoxed new acquaintances. Meanwhile, I gazed around the room, noting a fine open fire protected by a cage-like fire guard. Along its brass top, a row of knitted gloves steamed gently. There were some large wooden cupboards, and one glass-fronted one with an interesting-looking collection of books. They turned out to be remarkably dreary, as it happened. The windows were high, but a few fish paste jars stood on the window sills, holding early primroses and violets. In this room, too, each desk held 2 children of the same sex. Exercise books were open before them, and pens were in hand, but naturally work was suspended while my mother and I were there to be scrutinized. At length, the headmaster took us to the door, telling Miss Ellis in passing that I should be in her class. This time we went through the boys' lobby, said our farewells to Mr. Clark, descended the steps to the village street, and began the long walk home. I wonder now why I was not left there for the day, but there must have been some good reason. In any case, it was very pleasant to have a few hours' breathing space and to mull over in my mind the first impressions of this extraordinary place, which bore no resemblance to my idea of a school. "Do you think you will like it?" my mother asked when we were halfway home. "Yes," I said with conviction. I suspect, on looking back, that she had some doubts about the type of education I should receive there. She, too, was accustomed to the ways of large town schools and knew from her teacher sister Rose the high standards of attainment expected from the pupils and the relentless pressure kept up to ensure scholastic success. Payment by results was not at all that far behind in the teaching profession in those days, and class teachers were on their mettle to prove their worth. I had plenty to think about. I remembered those watching eyes, boys alarmingly strange as well as girls. There was not one person among them that I knew. No Aunt Rose would be with me as a protector, either on the long journey to school and back, or in that queer, quiet little building. And my sister, too, was now far away. I should be alone and a stranger in a completely different world. Facing the unknown. Opposite Julian Brimstone Farm stood a pair of farm cottages, and in one of them lived a young family called Whitehead. The father worked for the local farmer, not the one who lived at Julian Brimstone Farm, but a much larger landowner whose acres lay on the other side of the road. One of his fields was opposite our own house. Incidentally, it was in this field one day in the late 20s that I heard a little boy walking round the edge, rattling a tin with stones in it, and singing hoarsely, "Oh, all you blacky tops, keep off my master's crops. Here I come with my big gun, la 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 la." He could not have been more than 9 years of age. Dan Whitehead was fair, of ruddy complexion, and cheerful. His wife was tall, with very dark eyes and black hair, a handsome woman. She agreed very kindly to my mother's request that her daughter Hilda might look after me on the journey to and from school, at least for the first few days. We became firm friends. Her little brother Billy was too young then to come to school, but Hilda had had her share of minding children and was conscientious in looking after me. I was exceedingly glad of her company. I got to know that mile-and-a-quarter journey very well, for I made it 4 times a day. In that first spring, it was Hilda who showed me where the beds of violets grew, some white and sweet-smelling, some dog violets of blue, and one rare bed of pink ones, whose whereabouts we kept secret. She also showed me a blackbird's nest near her gate, not far from a patch of snowberries, whose white globes enchanted us later in the year. Every morning we called at Hilda's grandmother's house, one of a pair of clapboarded cottages a little further along the lane. I was rather afraid of the old lady, for although she was kind and later invited us to pick gooseberries in an old overgrown orchard at the end of her garden, she had an appalling cough and looked so ill when caught in one of its paroxysms, I feared she would die in front of us. Hilda took all this in her stride, and we collected there a small boy called Kenneth, who was being fostered in the house. In her grandmother's scullery was a fascinating green globe which stood in a jar of water. According to the old lady, it was a weather gauge, but I never understood how it worked. Kenneth, like Shakespeare's schoolboy, crept unwillingly to school, and Hilda had to use all her wiles to get him there. We also collected a younger cousin of Hilda's on the way, so that we were quite a little band as we approached the village. Between us, on our journey, we made wonderful discoveries. A robin had built a nest on a ledge inside a hollow damson tree near the younger cousin's house. A blackbird had another tucked among a tangle of honeysuckle at the top of a steep bank. Luckily, it was close to a telegraph pole, which helped our climbing efforts on the way to inspect the nest. Good children that we were, we did not touch the eggs, but Hilda, experienced and wise, warned us not to tell any of the big boys. "They are cruel," she assured us. "I've seen some of them throw the little birds on the road and stamp on them." We were suitably horrified and swore never to tell of our discoveries. About halfway to school stood a great pile of gray flints ready for road mending. This, of course, we climbed and ran along, enjoying a heady glimpse of the fields beyond the top of the hedge. Opposite, in that first year, there was a field of sage. I had never seen more than a wispy sprig or two in London gardens, and to see and smell a whole fieldful was an amazing experience. Between the sage field and the church stood a splendid Georgian house called Court Lodge, but even more intriguing to us children was the lodge at its gates, for in the garden of this house stood a high pole to which was fixed a length of wire which ran to the roof of the house. It was my first introduction to a wireless aerial. Later, we had one in our own garden, and a crystal set in the sitting room with headphones to listen to the crackling and occasional voice which emerged miraculously from the paraphernalia. A pretty girl called Elise lived at the lodge and frequently joined our party on the way to school. She had curly auburn hair and was in Mr. Clark's class. As she also told us something about the hallowed wireless in her home, she was obviously treated with respect. By this time, we were almost in the village, and as we entered the street, as the local people called it, we could see knots of children approaching from other directions. All were on foot. I don't remember even a bicycle being ridden by a child to school, and school buses, of course, were far in the future. Some walked from Well Hill, a mile or so north of the village, some from an outpost to the west. A few came from scattered cottages on the road from the station. Miss Smith herself, the kindly ruler of the infants class for many years, came by train and walked the lonely mile from there every school morning and back in the afternoon, in rain or shine. Most of the houses in the village itself had children living in them. Some of the families were large. There were 8 or 9 offspring in one cottage close to the school, and a good many parents had 4 or 5 children. As the school bell began to ring, the Divills and Martins emerged from their houses near Groom's, the baker, the Sparrowhawks from theirs near Neal's, the grocer's, Margaret Smith from the post office, Harold and Violet Smith, no relation incidentally, from a handsome clapboard house, and the Wickendens from another nearby. By the time the bell stopped, almost 100 children had assembled. Mr. Clark appeared in the playground, lines were formed, and boys and girls aged from 5 to 14 entered the lobbies to start another day. On my first morning, it was soon apparent that this school bore no resemblance to my old one. There we had assembled for morning prayers in an enormous hall. Miss Pope had stood on the dais, resplendent in an ankle-length dove-gray frock, with a watch pinned over her heart and a Bible on the table before her. After singing the hymn and saying prayers, we all sat cross-legged on the floor to listen to a story from the Bible, and to take heed of any notices given out before returning to our classrooms. One of the staff played a march on the piano, and we did our best to keep in time as we stomped away. Here, Mr. Clark stood in the doorway of the partition, which divided Standards 1, 2, 3, and 4 from Standards 5, 6, and 7, his own class. Miss Ellis sat at the piano hard by, and we sang a hymn following the words from some rather scruffy hymn books which we had to share. The infants, it seemed, attended to their devotions in their own classroom. Prayers were said with bowed heads. Mr. Clark told us that he expected less noise in the playground than he had heard yesterday. The door was closed, and we sat down at our desks, ready for a scripture lesson. Now I had time to look about me as Miss Ellis began the story of Joseph and his brothers. There was a large photograph of Queen Mary and King George V behind Miss Ellis's desk. He was ablaze with medals and decorations, a fine upstanding figure with a neat beard. His queen was wasp-waisted in white lace, a star on her breast, her hair crisply waved. They were a handsome pair, I thought, and I was proud that my father had fought for them in France in the Royal Horse Artillery. A large marmalade-colored cupboard stood beside the photograph, and on its side hung a little board headed Attendance. This was divided into 5, one section for each school day of the week. One of the big boys from Standard 7, I was to discover, came round in the morning and afternoon to count heads and put the total on his little board. There was a large open fire surrounded by a sturdy fire guard. I could feel its warmth from my seat in a front desk, shared with a little girl introduced to me as Rose. Our desk was old and heavily scarred. It had 2 inkwells, one let into the middle and the other at the end. A groove ran from one to the other, and in it rested our pens, with lovely orange wooden holders. Mine had a new nib. Rose's had seen some wear. There was a large blackboard propped on an easel, and Miss Ellis's chalk rested in a groove on the crossbar of this. When the scripture lesson was over, she began to put up some addition and subtraction sums in hundreds, tens, and units, and these I found I could do, although with some difficulty. Arithmetic was not my strong point, but my early schooling carried me through, and the fact that I knew my tables inside out concealed the knowledge that this was about all I did know about the subject. At playtime, I rushed to find Hilda. Rose accompanied us, and Miss Margaret from the post office was friendly and showed me the gap where her tooth had just come out. I much appreciated the honor and tried to hide my horror at the sight. It was after play that my first problem arrived. "Take out your writing books," said Miss Ellis. She handed me a brand new one and then turned to the blackboard. I forget what she wrote, but whatever it was inscribed in copperplate. I could not read it, let alone copy it. At my old school, we'd been taught to print, to do script as it called, with each letter separate from the next. I watched Rose dip in her pen and start to copy the elaborate rigmarole. Despair engulfed me. "Go on, dear," said Miss Ellis. "I can't," I faltered. "I've only done script." "We done that in infants," said an insufferable boy in the next row. "When we had pencils," contributed another smug child. Miss Ellis took charge and ushered me up to her desk with my pristine writing book. Every eye was upon me. "Just show me how you write," she said encouragingly, and waved toward the incomprehensible scribble on the board. "I can't read it," I confessed, now near to tears. "It says, 'March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb.' You can use my inkwell." I did so, and standing at her desk printed the sentence in my best script. As I finished, the door opened and in came Mr. Clark. Miss Ellis rose, and the two had a whispered conversation above my head. Mr. Clark took up my book. "She can't do real writing," said the insufferably smug boy. "But you can read every word," retorted Mr. Clark, "which is more than I can say about your scrawl." I loved him from that moment. Settling down. Looking back, I now realize how lucky I was to arrive in Chelsfield at just that time. Although the village was only 17 miles from Charing Cross and a mere 2 miles from the main London to Hastings road, it remained a close-knit rural community. Most of the wage earners worked on the farms, although 2 or 3 fine houses, such as Court Lodge, provided domestic employment for several more. There were 2 bakeries in the village and a grocer's shop, and those 2 had 1 or 2 local men acting as indoor help or drivers of delivery vans. One baker still delivered his bread in a high gig with a spanking bay horse to draw it. It was a fruit-growing area, strawberries being one of the main crops. Gooseberries and raspberries also did well, and later in the year the orchards produced excellent apples, pears, and plums. There were no hops grown in our village, but extensive hop fields were cultivated some miles south toward the Weald of Kent. Our school holidays were sensibly adapted to the seasons, for as well as short holidays at Christmas and Easter, we had a 3-week fruit-picking holiday in early July and a 3-week hop-picking holiday in September. It was this acknowledgement of nature's importance and its direct influence on rural economy which gave me such delight. The seasons, when I lived in London, had small effect on one's life. Certainly, clothes had to be warmer in winter. The muffin man rang his bell, and the coal cart was a regular feature of the winter scene, just as the water cart with its sprinkler was a sign of summer. But in a town school, one was hardly aware of the change of seasons. Holidays came at Christmas and Easter, and the main one in August when our family went to Walton-on-the-Naze to stay with my grandparents and to share the windswept beach with other children also on holiday. I relished the change to breaks in July and September when the country was full of interest. Shabby August, with its drying grass and end-of-summer feeling, might just as well be spent in school, where I grew increasingly happy. My early fears, particularly of the boys, whose company had virtually vanished when I became a big girl at the age of 6 in my old school, now disappeared. It was true that they teased me, but I could take that cheerfully, used as I was to my father's bantering ways. In any case, I soon found that the girls were very motherly, and would rush to the assistance of any young thing being persecuted. On the whole, they were a well-mannered, pleasant set of children, whose parents would not brook disrespect, disobedience, or bad language. Most of us went either to the parish church of St. Martin's or to the Wesleyan chapel, which stood opposite the school. Mr. Clark, the kindest of men, nevertheless stood no nonsense from his pupils, and the canes stood in readiness for those whose behavior merited its attention. All of us knew our limits, and if we were foolish or bold enough to kick over the traces, we knew well what was in store. It all contributed to a peaceful and well-ordered society. And we'll take a look at this society a little more next time.